So we're supposed to be looking at book 9 here, but I had not yet done book 4, and I would like to do that. Did you comment or question before I?
Are you handing out our assignment next class?
Yes. So I said to somebody, and I think it was after the class, I mean, I have the questions. I've taught this course now. This is year 17 of teaching this class, and I have the questions. I wanted people to read the text before coming to my questions, because otherwise you look at the questions and you read the text to answer the question. And the questions are obviously things worth thinking about, but they're not the only things worth thinking about. And I just find when you read a text with a certain view in mind, other than taking it on its own merits, you don't appreciate it to the same degree. And you're doing it for a purpose, and the purpose is to finish your essay. Right? And I don't want to undermine that, but at the same time, there's more to this course than writing essays and getting grades. Right? So it is intentional on my part. It's not an oversight. But I will try and give them to you after we've got through Paradise Lost, and then before we move on to Pope and Swift. But it will mean there's not a lot of time for the essay to be written. But then I don't want you to take weeks and weeks to write it either. You should be thinking about it as we're writing it. But that's the rationale for it. Okay, so we're in book 4. We left off in heaven last time. So once again, just to very briefly reiterate, book 1, Invocation of the Muse, announces his whole claim to write an epic, and this epic will be not like the pagan epics. It will soar far above those and justify the ways of God to man, so he says. And then it goes down to describe hell and Satan and the angels in the fiery gulf and their plans to go and pervert mankind. So it begins in some ways before the count of Scripture. So if you look at the Bible, it begins with Adam and Eve created in the garden in Genesis 1-3. Paradise Lost begins with a story that, if in terms of chronology, would predate that. And because it does beg the question, so there's a serpent in the garden. Who is this serpent? It's clearly not just a snake. It's something else here, and what's going on here, and it begs all sorts of questions. Why would the serpent be wanting to deceive these creatures? And so he's sort of filling in the background there. He's taking it from various sources and so forth, but the ordering of things is interesting, and he's trying to give an account there, and I think it's interesting, and it was helpful to me when I first read it. And as I said to the class before I started recording, I found it really hard to understand at first, but I knew that there was something great here, and also true. And I wasn't a Christian when I read it. I know that this is right in some way. I didn't take it to be a literal history. I'm not, but you know what I mean. Book 4. So we left book 2, Satan arising from hell, being persuading sin and death to let him through, and up to do his dirty deed, promising them that they would have great benefit of his success. They would be able to. Death would have all the food he wanted, because everything would die if he was successful, and sin would be able to avoid being death's prey herself and being tormented, because everyone would love sin. She loves to be loved. And so he persuades them, and then in book 3, there's the council in heaven. In the classical epic, the council of the gods is part of the epic convention. Here it's the council of God. The Father and the Son are conversing, discussing what's going on. And they see everything. And in fact, they see not only what is going to what has happened and what is about to happen, but what will ultimately happen. So God foresees Satan coming out, foresees that he will pervert mankind, succeed in it, and he also pronounces his grace, which in terms of a chronology would take place Well, at the year 0 AD, right, when Christ enters the world as a man and so forth and dies in man's place. So he pronounces grace. Well, all this is before Adam and Eve even bitten the apple, if we're reckoning it in space and time, but God's outside of that. And we have to remember that, and that's, as I said, part of Milton's problem was portraying God who would transcend our confines of creaturely existence. And one of the reasons he's unsuccessful is simply because what he tries to do is not possible. But we left off with that, and now book 4 moves us to the earthly paradise, so Eden. And now we get to meet the human couple for the first time. I wanted to look at that briefly before we then look at the scene of temptation in book 9. But the argument is Satan now in prospect of Eden and nigh the place where he must now attempt the bold enterprise which he undertook alone against God and man, falls into many doubts with himself and many passions. So Satan presents himself as a heroic figure, but then when he finally gets to do the thing he does, we find that he's prone to all sorts of anxieties and doubts and uncertainties, which he hasn't displayed in front of others, but now that he's on his own, they arise. And despair, even the worst of all, despair, sparrow in Latin, S-P-E-R-O, means to hope. He has no hope. This is the worst. This is the thing that drives him totally mad, is that he has no hope of redemption. He knows that he is against God and that his whatever he does will fail. He can't succeed. He's not that stupid. And yet he is driven by his own hatred of God to do it. And God, furthermore, is using him to do it, like aware of this, and is going to bring evil out of good, or good out of evil. He's aware of all those things, and yet he can't help himself. He's addicted to sin and himself and his desires. And so, but at length, confirms himself in evil. And then he journeys on to paradise and he looks at Adam and Eve and all that. So let me come to this. So he leaves off Milton and he picks up with these lines. Oh, for that warning voice which he who saw the apocalypse heard cry in heaven aloud. Then, when the dragon, put to second rout, came furious down to be avenged on men. Woe to the inhabitants on earth, that now, while time was, our first parents had been warned the coming of their secret foe, and scaped, haply so scaped, his mortal snare. For now Satan, now first inflamed with rage, came down, the tempter, ere the accuser of mankind, to wreak on innocent, frail man his loss of that first battle and his flight to hell. I'll stop there just briefly. This, the second route and the dragon put to second route is retold in Revelation 12. So if you want texts that support Milton's narrative, Genesis 1-3 is an obvious place, but Revelation 12 is in some ways a more fulsome account. And the Bible's sort of synopsis of the entirety of history is there in Revelation 12. It's the hermeneutic key for reading the book of Revelation furthermore. But he now goes forth, and yet we're told, line 13, yet not rejoicing in his speed, though bold, far off and fearless, nor with cause to boast, begins his dire attempt, which nigh the birth now rolling, boils in his tumultuous breast, and like a devilish engine back recoils upon himself. Now, Milton has in mind here when he's talking about an engine, where this is the head of the steam engine, so he's thinking of a cannon. So when a cannon shoots, it recoils backwards. So he's aiming at God, but it comes back on himself. So if you've ever watched in movies when they shoot cannons, even guns to these days, it recoils, right? It pushes it out, but it pushes itself back. So he intends to harm God, but he only harms himself. And horror and doubt distract his troubled thoughts, and from the bottom stir the hell within him. For within him hell he brings, and round about him, nor from hell one step no more than from himself can fly by change of place. Now conscience wakes despair that slumbered, wakes the bitter memory of what he was, what is, and what must be worse. Of worse deeds, worse sufferings must ensue. Sometimes towards Eden, which now in his view lay pleasant, his grieved look he fixes sad. Sometimes towards heaven, and the full blazing sun, which now sat in his meridian tower. Then much revolving thus in sighs began. I'll interrupt myself and the narrative and come back to it in a sec, but just this comment. In line 20, it says that the hell is within him, for within him hell he brings, and round about him, nor from hell one step no more than from himself can fly by change of place. This is a very interesting comment, because he's not in hell. He is in sight of paradise. And furthermore, remember, and he's going to repeat this in line 75, I'll come to this in a second. He claims in book 1 that the mind is in its own place and in and of itself can create a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. It doesn't matter if I'm in hell, as long as I don't think I am, because I'm in control of my own thoughts. That's his assertion. Here we find in the midst of paradise, when looking upon the heavenly, not heavenly, but the earthly paradise that God has prepared for Adam and Eve, that hell is with him wherever he goes. So he's not even in control of what he said he had control over, namely his own thoughts. He's tormented. And hell is presented now not only as a geographical place, which Milton clearly described. It has a spatial location, as it were, and although really its location is almost in relation to God, and where's God's location, it's not clear, because he doesn't occupy space and time, right? So again, the idea of God in a place is almost a category mistake. It's a children's question. Where does God live? You know, and adults struggle to answer it because it's not an answerable question according to the terms the child wants. You could say up there. Not quite right. That suggests a spatial temporal location. He's a spiritual being. Doesn't, right? So it's not. You can't quite say that. And so his claim that he can be away, that he can be in heaven as long as he thinks such things, one, is false, and two, is not only false, but it's the exact opposite of the case. Hell is wherever Satan is, and it accompanies him wherever he is and wherever he goes. So it goes from being a physical location where the poem began to have a further implication, and probably a more correct one, that it's a spiritual state. He has hellish thoughts. And they're actually worsened by being in the presence of anything other than hell, because they remind him of what he no longer has and no longer can have. So he's in despair. It's a source of torment to him. And he can't flee from hell because he can't flee from himself. And remember, this is what he wanted, and that's what caused the sin to begin with. He loved himself. And that caused sin to spring out of the left side of his head. Like Athena came out of the left side of Zeus's head, so sin sprang out of Satan's head, Lucifer's head. And then he loved himself so much that he begot this horrible creature, death. And so there's something adulterous, incestuous, sick about the whole endeavor, and yet at the same time, Satan is self-obsessed. He is always thinking of himself, even when he claims to be liberating others. So he talks the language of a liberator, precisely when he's most enslaving them and making them his slaves. And this is his agenda. So he has very twisted thinking. But here we're being given a description of Satan, not in his own words, but Milton's description of him. So but he looks up and he sees the full blazing sun. And when he sees the full blazing sun, which he hasn't seen in hell, but now that he's on earth, he does, it reminds him of heaven. Milton just saw light, although actually He couldn't see light because he has no eyes, right? But he hailed light. But that light was a spiritual light, the light of the world. And the sun is not that light. That the sun is at best a metaphor for that light. It's a physical embodiment of what the true light is, the light that lights every man that comes into the world, as John's gospel puts it. But he sees the sun, and this is what Satan says, 32. O thou, that with surpassing glory crowned, lookst from thy sole dominion like the God of this new world, at whose sight all the stars hide their diminished heads. To thee I call, but with no friendly voice, and add thy name, O sun, to tell thee how I hate thy beams, that bring to my remembrance from what state I fell, how glorious once above thy sphere, till pride and worse ambition threw me down, warring in heaven against heaven's matchless king. Now, a moment of regret, and you were not going to see it much in here, so I think there's a moment of candor here. Satan is not speaking to anyone else, he's speaking to himself, so I think he speaks truthfully here, ever so briefly, in the presence of the light. And what does he say? Ah, wherefore? Why did I war against heaven's matchless king? He deserved no such return from me, whom he created what I was in that bright eminence, and with his good upbraided none, nor was his service hard. What could be less than to afford him praise, the earliest recompense, the easiest recompense, and pay him thanks? How do? Yet all his good proved ill in me, and wrought but malice. So there's a lot of, and you'll see this, and it's well exemplified in the Lord of the Rings, the movie, where you get Smeagol and Gollum. Smeagol being the old hobbit creature, the good in him, and Gollum being the creature that kills the Deagle, his cousin, and they're warring within him. You see the two, and so you almost see that within Satan. So there's the little bit of him that remains good, and if there was nothing of good in him, by the way, he would not exist at all. Because existence as a predicate is good, because God created everything good. Everything that exists has a sense of goodness in it. The malignity is in his relation to God, not in his being. His being is not evil. His will is, and his intention and his spirit is. Right? So anyway, so you get the good side of him. He said, but he didn't deserve any of that, and his service was easy, and what could be easier than to give him praise for what he deserved? Then he goes on, and here's the twisting then. Yet all his good proved ill in me, and wrought but malice. Lifted up so high, I disdained subjection, and thought one step higher would set me highest, and in a moment quit the debt immense of endless gratitude. So burthensome, still paying, still to owe, forgetful that from him I still received, and understood not that a grateful mind by owing owes not, but still pays, at once indebted and discharged. What burden then? Oh, had his powerful destiny ordained me some inferior angel, I had stood then happy. No unbounded hope had raised ambition. He's presenting hypothetical philosophical positions. Why did I fall? Because I was so high. Well, how about if he had created me a little bit lower? Maybe then I wouldn't have been tempted to take one step up. So let's just imagine it had been otherwise. No unbounded had raised ambition. Yet why not? Some other power as great might have aspired, and me, through mean, drawn to his part. But other powers as great fell not, but stand unshaken, from within or from without, to all temptations armed. Hadst thou the same free will and power to stand? Thou hadst. Whom hast thou then, or what to accuse? But heaven's free love dealt equally to all. So he's now convicted himself. There's a dialogue going in. He's convicted himself in his own mind. Be then, now he's resolved in his wickedness, be then his love accursed. Since love or hate to me alike, it deals eternal woe. Nay, cursed be thou, since against his thy will chose freely what it now so justly rues. Now he just feels sorry for himself. Me miserable. Which way shall I fly infinite wrath and infinite despair? Which way I fly is hell. Myself am hell. And in the lowest deep, a lower deep, still threatening to devour me, opens wide, to which the hell I suffer seems a heaven. Oh, then at last, relent. Is there no place left for repentance? None for pardon left? None left but by submission. And that word disdain forbids me, and my dread of shame among the spirits beneath, whom I seduced with other promises and other vaunts, that than to submit, boasting I could subdue the omnipotent. Ay me, they little know how dearly I abide that boast so vain, under what torments inwardly I groan, while they adore me on the throne of hell, with diadem and scepter high advanced, the lower still I fall. Only supreme in misery, such joy ambition finds. But say I could repent and could obtain by act of grace my former state, how soon would height recall high thoughts? How soon unsay what feigned submission swore? Else would recant vows made in pain as violent and void. For never can true reconcilement grow where wounds of deadly hate have pierced so deep, which would but lead me to a worse relapse and heavier fall. So should I purchase dear short intermission bought with double smart. This knows my punisher. Therefore, as far from granting he as I from begging peace. All hope excluded thus, behold, instead of us outcast, exiled, his new delight, mankind created, and for him this world. So farewell hope, and with hope farewell fear, farewell remorse. All good to me is lost. Evil, be thou my good. Be by thee at least divided empire with heaven's king I hold by thee, and more than half perhaps will reign as man ere long, and this new world shall know. Thus while he spake, so there's Satan's words. This is Milton's commentary on Satan. Thus while he spake, each passion dimmed his face, thrice changed with pale ire, envy, and despair, which marred his borrowed visage, and betrayed him counterfeit, if any eye beheld. For heavenly minds from such distempers foul are ever clear, whereof he, soon aware, each perturbation smoothed with outward calm, artificer of fraud, and was the first that practiced falsehood under saintly show. Deep malice to conceal, couched with revenge, yet not enough had practiced to deceive Uriel, one of the angels, once warned, whose eye pursued him down the way he went, and on the Assyrian mount saw him disfigured, more than could befall spirit of happier sort. His gestures fiercely marked and sad demeanor, etc. I'll skip off there, but note these famous lines, evil be thou my good, line 110. And back on the line 75, when he say, which way I fly is hell, myself am hell, if you go back to book 1, line 234, there's an echoing of those lines there as well. Book 1, 254 rather. The mind is not changed by place or time. The mind is his own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. Not so. He has no power over his own thoughts even. God is in control not only of his outward circumstances, but of his inward. But there's lots of echoing going on here, lots of references to different types of hell. There's a place called hell. There's a spiritual state called hell. There's all sorts of, so there's an inner geography almost of hell within Satan. And the possibilities, he just raises possibilities other than the one that he will soon follow, and there are no possibilities for him. Evil be thou my good, says he, line 110. Now he comes down, and I am going to come to the description of Adam and Eve. So he sees them and he sits like a cormorant in a tree, line 196, which is historically, traditionally, conventionally a symbol of greed. So he's looking upon Adam and Eve on a tree. It's telling. He says, yet not, and he's on the tree of life. This is very interesting, because the tree of life will one day be the cross, which is a tree of death. That will be the means of true life. But Satan now, who intends death, is sitting on the tree of life like a cormorant, greedy for their souls. And I'll read this. So clomb 193, this first grand thief into God's fold. So since in his church lewd hirelings climb, thence up he flew, and on the tree of life, the middle tree, and highest there that grew. No, it's the middle tree. And Milton is implicitly making a veiled reference to the cross, where there are three that were hung. One in the middle is where Christ hung, right? And it's the highest of the three. Think of how it's depicted in paintings, in art. Yet not, he sits on the tree of life, yet not true life thereby regained, but sat devising death to them who lived. Nor on the virtue thought of that life-giving plant, but only used for prospect. That well used had been the pledge of immortality. So little knows any, but God alone, to value right the good before him, but perverts best things to worst abuse, or to their meanest use. Beneath him with new wonder now he views, to all delight of human sense exposed in narrow room nature's whole wealth. The word Eden means, has the connotations of pleasure. This is a garden. Eden is a place within the garden, and it's a delightful place that God has placed them in. And a heaven on earth, it's even described, 207. For blissful paradise of God the garden was, by him in the east of Eden planted. Eden stretched her line from Auran eastward to the royal towers of great Seleucia, built by Grecian kings, etc., etc. Let me skip over the depiction of mankind, which he soon sees on 285. And then we're going to jump forward to the temptation scene. 285. The fiend saw undelighted all delight. Isn't that a great way of putting it? He saw undelighted all delight. It's a symptom of his hellish state. He can't delight in anything, even the delightful. That's undelightful to him. All kind of living creatures new to sight and strange. Two of far nobler shape, erect and tall, godlike erect, with native honor clad in naked majesty, seemed lords of all, and worthy seemed, for in their looks divine the image of their glorious Maker shone. Truth, wisdom, sanctitude severe and pure, severe but in true filial freedom placed, whence true authority in men. Though both not equal, as their sex not equal seemed, for contemplation he and valor formed, for softness she and sweet attractive grace. He for God only, she for God in him. His fair, large front and eye sublime declared absolute rule, and hyacinthine locks round from his parted forelock manly hung, clustering, but not beneath his shoulders broad. So he's got long hair, but it's not so long that it goes below the shoulder length. It was the fashion of Milton's day, by the way. They had long hair, but it didn't go beneath the shoulders, because that would be womanly. But anyway. She, as a veil down to the slender waist, her unadorned golden tresses wore disheveled, but in wanton ringlets waved as the vine curls her tendrils, which implied subjection, but required with gentle sway, and by her yielded, by him best received, yielded with coy submission, modest pride, and sweet, reluctant, amorous delay. Nor those mysterious parts, the sexual organs, in case you're wondering, were then concealed. Then was not guilty shame, dishonest shame, of nature's works honor dishonorable, sin bred. How have ye troubled all mankind with shows instead, mere shows of seeming pure, and banished from man's life his happiest life, simplicity and spotless innocence. So passed they naked on, nor shunned the sight of God or angel, for they thought no ill. So hand in hand they passed. And I want you to underline that passage, hand in hand. It's repeated in the epic over and over. The hand holding of Adam and Eve, it has symbolic significance. So hand in hand they passed, the loveliest pair that ever since in love's embrace has met. Adam, the goodliest man of men since born his sons, the fairest of her daughters, Eve. So this is a depiction of the first pair, and they're presented as godlike. Lewis, in that work I talked about, the Preface to Paradise Lost, in describing Adam and Eve, said that if we were to meet them, we would probably be tempted to throw ourselves at their feet as if they were gods. And Adam and Eve, you have to understand as well, and this is helpful information, because of the way modern scholarship thinks about humanity and its origins. It presents the original people as lacking in intelligence or lacking in knowledge at any rate. So like the caveman carrying the cave woman around, dragging around by the hair and so forth. Why he should do that, why she should do that, where they get the evidence for that, for which there is no evidence, is that it's a construct. They've totally made it up. There's no evidence of this ever happening, or primitive man being ignorant or lacking in intelligence. There's no evidence whatsoever. There's no evidence to the contrary either. There's simply no evidence. But in Christian theology and Christian understanding, Adam would have had the knowledge that no scientist in our day does. He would know all things in their nature. He would be the great scientist. He knew things and he named them. When he named them, that was their nature. He wasn't just giving them a name, like we name our kids and we come up with a strange name because we like the sound of it. When Adam names things, he's describing it and saying, this is what this is. When he names it, that is what it is. He's got it right. God endorses that. That's correct. You've said it so. So he even names his wife, which is a sign of dominion. Why does he call her Eve? What does Eve mean? It means life. She is the source of all. It's a correct name for her. It's not just he liked the sound of it. And so Adam and Eve are great figures, like figures you will not meet anywhere else in literature. And Milton is at pains to suggest this. Nor are their relations marked by the sinful things that we associate with humanity. So they're both proud and humble. There's no false pride. There's no false humility. There's no pretense whatsoever. They're courteous. They speak, Lewis remarks, like a king and a queen would talk. Always polite, as if the Empress of Heaven were being addressed by the Emperor. So they speak in courtly tones, because they are, in fact, the kings over the created order, and they speak as such to one another. So there's a lot of courtesy being demonstrated, and it may sound a little bit elaborate or put on, but Milton's trying to convey something of the majesty of the first human pair. And they're hand in hand, and they are good. And they go there, and when Satan sees them, I'll stop that. I'll come to that, and then we'll move on. 358. Satan still in gaze, at first he stood, scarce thus at length, failed speech recovered sad. Isn't that a great way of putting it? All those in one line. Satan, scarce thus at length, failed speech recovered sad. Failed, recovered, sad. All compact. It's bad English. Not for a poet. He's conveying all of the images or all the emotions he's going through in one sense. And then what does he say? Oh, hell. What do mine eyes with grief behold? Into our room of bliss, thus high advanced, creatures of other mold. Earthborn perhaps, not spirits, yet to heavenly spirits bright, little inferior, whom my thoughts pursue with wonder, and could love, so lively shines in them divine resemblance. And such grace the hand that formed them on their shape hath poured. Ah, gentle pair, ye little think how nigh your change approaches, when all these delights will vanish and deliver ye to woe. More woe the more your taste is now of joy. Happy, but for so happy, ill secured long to continue. And this high seat, your heaven, ill fenced for heaven to keep out such a foe as now is entered. Yet no purposed foe to you whom I could pity thus forlorn, though I unpitied, league with you I seek, and mutual amity, so straight, so close, that I with you must dwell, or you with me henceforth. So I love you, and we're going to be united. I'll marry you, more or less. I don't want to push you away. I want to pull you close. My dwelling haply may not please like this fair paradise, your sense. Yet such accept your Maker's work. He gave it me, which I as freely give. Hell shall unfold, to entertain you two, her widest gates, and send forth all her kings. There will be room, not like these narrow limits, to receive your numerous offspring. If no better place, thank him who puts me loath to this revenge on you who wrong me not for him who wronged. And should I at your harmless innocence melt, as I do, yet public reason just, honor and empire with revenge enlarged, by conquering this new world compels me now to do what else, though damned, I should abhor. So spake the fiend, and with necessity the tyrant's plea excused his evil deeds. Then from his lofty stand on that high tree down he alights from the sportful herd of these fourfold kinds, himself now one, now another. So he keeps switching, he changes shape from one four-footed beast to another. Eventually he will decide to put himself in the guise of a toad. But never mind. But he keeps shifting, he's capable of shifting. But note the commentary here, and note Milton's comment on the commentary. He excuses his wicked deed, which has no justice in it. They don't deserve this. And he says that he's forced to do it, forced to do a wicked thing. He has no choice. And Milton refers to him as a tyrant who not only excuses his own wickedness, but blames other people for it. The phrase that one would use in our day is gaslighting. He's gaslighting God, accusing God of what he is going to do. He bears no blame himself. There's no guilt. And the perversion of his thinking suggests that he loves the people who actually he's going to pervert and ruin. So all of this is twisted and awful. And I'm going to need to skip on here to book 9. I'm not going to get through all of book 9 today, but I'll get through a fair bit of it, and then we'll pick it up next time and do 10 to 12 as well. But let me at least begin with 9 and get to, hopefully, the temptation scene itself. Book 9. So book 1 has an invocation, the Muse. Book 3 has, so does book 7. So after the war in heaven, the archangel comes down and speaks to Adam and warns him of what's coming once again. Warns him of Satan and the threat to his life. And then book 9 begins, and then there's a fourth and final invocation. So there are 4 invocations. And now we're back on earth. And what I'm going to submit to you, and it's not based on my own opinion, it's Milton's own description, there's a tragedy going to be told within the context of the epic. So book 9 is a mini tragedy that will tell of the fall of mankind. Now the tragedies, we saw it in the first semester, at least in my class, in Oedipus Rex, is a a state where a man blunders into doing a wicked deed out of ignorance and pride. And in Oedipus's case, he married his mother, killed his father, had offspring from his mother, so incest and so forth. And he was fated to do this all along. And there was a tragic aspect of human nature here. Milton, when he refers to a tragedy here, is invoking that sense of there's something fated about it, and also, on the other hand, something awful and corrupt. But let me come to this. Book 9, and I'll read the whole invocation here. Because at this point now, his final invocation, he once again compares what he is going to say is his epic material with what his forebears had. Remember, at first he said he would soar above the Aeonian Mount. He's referring to that. Now he's going to say a little bit more, and about what he had long planned to do, which is to write this epic even when he was a young man. I mentioned that to you earlier on. But I'll read that and then make comment on it, and how Milton will change the epic and transform it utterly. So no more, we read, of talk where God or angel guest with man, as with his friend, familiar used to sit indulgent, and with him partake rural repast, permitting him the while venial discourse unblamed. I now must change those notes to tragic, foul distrust, and breach disloyal on the part of man, revolt and disobedience. On the part of heaven, now alienated, distance and distaste, anger and just rebuke, and judgment given, that brought into this world a world of woe, sin and her shadow death, and misery, death's harbinger. Sad task. Yet argument not less, but more heroic than the wrath of stern Achilles on his foe pursued, thrice fugitive about Troy wall, or rage of Turnus for Lavinia disespoused, or Neptune's ire, or Juno's, that so long perplexed the Greek and Cytherea's son. If answerable style I can obtain of my celestial patroness, who deigns her nightly visitation unimplored, and dictates to me slumbering, or inspires easy my unpremeditated verse, since first this subject for heroic song pleased me long choosing, and beginning late, not sedulous by nature to indite wars, hitherto the only argument heroic deemed, chief mastery to dissect with long and tedious havoc fabled knights in battles feigned, the better fortitude of patience and heroic martyrdom unsung, or to describe races and games, impresses quaint, caparisons and steeds, bases and tinsel trappings, gorgeous knights at joust and tournament. Then marshalled feast served up in hall with sewers and seneschals, the skill of artifice or office mean, not that which justly gives heroic name to person or to poem. Me of these nor skilled nor studious. Higher argument remains, sufficient of itself to raise that name, unless an age too late or cold climate or years damp my intended wing depressed, and much they may, if all be mine, not hers who brings it nightly to my ear. So that's how he concludes that, line 47. So just a few comments here. So he makes the transition from book 8 to 9. Book 7 and 8 were Adam receiving a host, an angelic host, and the angelic host that with whom he discussed the nature of the cosmos, the different views of the way the universe was set up, and talking about all sorts of scientific things, and discussing all sorts of theological and natural things, and enjoying their conversation. And he's going to switch from that and now get back to the main subject matter, the fall of mankind. And so he has to shift the notes to tragic, and he says it is sad and yet it's heroic. And when he says heroic, it's not only heroic in the same way that the traditional epic is heroic, it is far more so. It's not about the wrath of Achilles. It's not about Aeneas and his slaying of Turnus in the Aeneid. It's not about Greek gods. It's not about Neptune. It's not about Venus, the goddess of love. None of those things. It's from his celestial patroness, which, as we've seen already, is the Holy Spirit. Urania, if you will, whom he invokes in Book 7. The one who's set up in the heavenly realms. If I can get from her answerable style that will answer to his great sense of vocation. And he claims here, visits him at night without even requesting. So when he sleeps, she tells him what he's to say in his epic. And dictates to me slumbering, or inspires easy my unpremeditated verse. So this is not from me, this comes directly from God. And then he goes on to explain that he had long sought to write this, and this is verified in other works of his published long before this, that he wanted to do a great epic. And at first he planned on writing an Arthurian epic. That was one of the things he considered, writing about the ancient history of England or something like that. He thought of doing that. In the end, he settled on this. But he did not want to talk about battles and physical fights, because he knows that the real enemy is not flesh and blood. And so he moves away from that to talk about spiritual matters. So here's the true fight. And the true fight will involve not proud, martial, fighting men, even if they're on steeds and are knights and so forth. It will involve a spiritual combat, and that he's fit to write about. He's not a man of war himself. He's a poet, although he's trained to fight. As all men, he used the sword of his age. And in his treatise of education, he says that all education should include that, the possibility of defending the realm, the kingdom. That's part of being a good citizen, is that defense. But he says that he is not skilled in talking about fighting and combat and war, but higher argument still remains. And it will be, now the victory will be the one that is won through faith. By faith in the one who wins the battle, the Lord Jesus, on the tree of life, which for him was the tree of death. That's the story, and that's the epic subject matter of his tale. But first he needs to talk about how we got to that point. So now, and he says that he will not succeed if it is only his words, but if it is hers, who he believes inspires his epic, then it will succeed. And whether he was correct in this, I think he is a pretty good argument to be made that it was pretty successful. So this was the most popular work in the English language, along with Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, alongside the Bible for centuries. People would read this. So, was that a comment or question? I saw a hand. No, it's okay. So let me pick up the narrative again. So setting the stage here, the sun was sunk, and after him, the star of Hesperus, whose office is to bring twilight upon the earth, short arbiter between day and night. And now from end to end, night's hemisphere had veiled the horizon round. When Satan, who late fled before the threats of Gabriel out of Eden, so we left off in book 4, he turned into a toad, the angels came down and poked him. There was a threatened fight between the angels on earth. God intervenes and says, don't do that, because if you get into a fight, you're going to burn up Eden. So let him go. He lets them go, and now that he's crept back in. Just to fill in the details here. He had midnight returned from compassing the earth, so he went all the way around the earth to get back there, cautious of day, since Uriel, regent of the sky, of the sun rather, descried his entrance, and forewarned the cherubim that kept their watch. Thence, full of anguish driven, the space of 7 continued nights he rode with darkness, thrice the equinoctial. So he's staying in the dark. He operates in the dark. And then he comes forth with this speech. I'll pick it up in line 99. And once again, he has this tone of delight and lament at the same time. O earth, 99, how like to heaven, if not preferred, more justly, seat worthier of gods, as built with second thoughts, reforming what was old. For what god after better, worse would build? Terrestrial heaven, danced round by other heavens that shine, yet bear their bright officious lamps, light above light, for thee alone as seems, in thee concentrating all their precious beams of sacred influence. As God in heaven is center, yet extends to all, so thou, centering, receives from all those orbs. In thee, not in themselves, all their known virtue appears productive in herb, plant, and nobler birth of creatures animate with gradual life, of growth, sense, season, all summed up in man. So there's a light here, and there's a growth, and reason and light seems to comprehend all of those things. Everything grows with light. Even the plants grow. Light is pulling them all, and light is at the center of man's reason, and everything there. Man seems the sum of creation. With what delight could I have walked thee round, if I could joy in aught? Sweet interchange of hill and valley, rivers, woods, and plains, now land, now sea, and shores with forest-crowned rocks, dens, and caves. But I in none of these find place or refuge, and the more I see pleasures about me, so much more I feel torment within me, as from the hateful siege of contraries. All good to me becomes bane, and in heaven much worse would be my state, for neither here seek I, no, nor in heaven to dwell, unless by mastering heaven's supreme, nor hope to be myself less miserable by what I seek, but others to make such as I, though thereby worse to me redound. For only in destroying I find ease to my relentless thoughts, and him destroyed, or one to what may work his utter loss, for whom all this was made, all this will soon follow, as to him linked in weal or woe. In woe then, that destruction wide may range, to me shall be the glory sole among the infernal powers, in one day to have marred what he Almighty styled 6 nights and days continued making, and who knows how long before had been contriving, though perhaps not longer than since I in one night freed from servitude and glorious, well nigh half the angelic name, and thinner left the throng of his adorers. He to be avenged, so Satan imagines that God's answering and following, he's dictating the terms. He to be avenged and to repair his numbers thus and fared, whether such virtues spent of old now failed more angels to create, or if they at least are his created, or despite us more, determined to advance into our room a creature formed of earth. So he's angry now, and his conjecture is that the third of the angels in heaven that came down, this is why God's created Adam and Eve, is to replace those numbers. Of course, he was told about the creation of man before the fall, so before their fall from heaven, before sin came about. So probably not an accurate depiction, but nothing he says here is true. It's all twisted, perverted. And worst of all, he decreed what God decreed he effected, 152. Man he made, and for him built magnificent this world, and earth his seat. Him Lord pronounced, and, oh indignity, subjected to his service angel wings, and flaming ministers to watch and tend their earthly charge. Of these the vigilant I dread, and to elude thus wrapped in mist of midnight vapor glide obscure, and pry in every bush and brake, where hap may find the serpent sleeping, in whose mazy folds to hide me, and the dark intent I bring. O foul descent, that I, who erst contended with gods to sit the highest, am now constrained into a beast and mixed with bestial slime. This essence to incarnate and imbrute, that to the height of deity aspired, but what will not ambition and revenge descend to? So he's disgusted the idea that he should have to have a physical body. He's disgusted that he should become incarnate. And again, an attentive reader recognizes the parallel and the contrast between God, the Son, and his willingness in his grace to become incarnate as man without disgust, though clearly with condescension and loss of glory. But he's disgusted at the mere thought of this, and the fact that mankind is being served by angels infuriates him as well. But he says, revenge at first, though sweet, bitter ere long, back on itself recoils, just like the engine, the cannon I suggested earlier. Let it, I reck not, so it light well aimed, since higher I fall short. On him who next provokes my envy, this new favorite of heaven, this man of clay, son of despite, whom us the more to spite his maker raised from dust. Spite then with spite is best repaid. So now that he creeps into the serpent, he's looking for the serpent, he finds the serpent. Why the serpent? Because the serpent and his coils and the labyrinth, so he possesses, it's not the serpent, it's Satan in the serpent. And the serpent doesn't go straight, and neither does Satan. And so it's the best creature to conceal him. That's why he inhabits the serpent. Not because there's anything particularly wicked per se about serpents, but it's the most like him. And mazy in its coils. And this word will come up again over and over. So this vow of revenge, these are great words. I think you can feel the force of them. Let's pick it up the human pair. Line 200, thereabouts. Yes, I need to read the intro to it because it makes sense of what Eve will say, because she speaks first. They join in vocal worship to the choir of creatures wanting voice. So they first praise God and sing. That done, 199, partake the season, prime for sweetest sense and airs. Then commune how that day they best may ply their growing work. For much their work outgrew the hands' dispatch of two gardening so wide. And Eve first to her husband thus began. So note these things. Adam and Eve have been created to tend the garden. They have work to do. Work is not a consequence of the fall. That's a pagan notion. You find it in all paganism. Pagan accounts of creation. Work is a curse to mankind. In its original state, mankind has no work to do. Whereas in the Christian rendering, which Milton echoes here, work is something that that God gives to bless mankind. And there's goodness to it. And furthermore is to subdue the earth. So there's a dominion that goes with it. And it's good for mankind, first of all, but it's also good for the earth. So this says something about creation care and the right relation of mankind to the earth. It's not, as contemporary environmentalism has it, the way we treat nature is by withdrawing from it, as if the nature would be better if it was left to its own devices. Not so. 'Twas never so. It's certainly not so after the fall. Because after the fall, if you don't cull the herd and you don't tend the garden, it grows thick with weeds. And creatures get diseases and they die. And so there's a need for agriculture and for herding and for domestication and so forth. That goes with the original Dominion mandate. And I say that just simply because one almost never hears that these days. And anyway, that's the portrait. And so she's speaking. And the problem is that they are successful in their gardening, but they're so successful because the earth is so productive that the faster that they succeed, the more the garden grows. And so they need more hands. And they're not there yet. And so Eve comes to Adam with this problem. And note, they discuss it. So they begin by singing doing their devotions, they sing praises to God, and then they talk about, well, what are we going to do today? We're going to go to work. We're going to go into the garden. So here's how it begins. Adam. Well, maybe labor to still to dress this garden, still to tend plant, herb, and flower, our pleasant tasks enjoined. But till more hands aid us, the work under our labor grows, luxurious by restraint. What we by day lop, overgrown, or prune, or prop, or bind, one night or two with wanton growth derides, tending to wild. Thou, therefore, now advise, or hear what to my mind first thoughts present. Let us divide our labors. Thou where choice leads thee, or where most needs, whether to wind the woodbine around this arbor, this tree, or direct the clasping ivy where to climb, while I, in yonder spring of roses intermixed with myrtle, find what to redress till noon. For while so near each other, thus all day our task we choose, what wonder if so near looks intervene, and smiles, or object new, casual discourse draw on, which intermits our day's work brought to little, though begun early and the hour of supper comes unearned. So, Eve is concerned like an economist, and by the word economics comes from the household, comes from oikos, which is the Greek word for house. And economics is the law of the house, the law of the household. Home economics used to be taught in schools. There's a law of the household, and there's a way of doing things, and running a productive household, balancing the budget, running your affairs. And so she's talking like a good Proverbs 31 woman would be, I guess, before Proverbs 31 is written. But she's busy and productive and has in mind, let's be productive. So here's the idea. We'll separate our labor and we'll be more productive, because otherwise we're going to see one another and we'll talk about things because the world's just so interesting. And then we won't be as productive. So let's enhance our productivity until there are children to help us. That's how it begins. Adam, to whom mild answer Adam thus returned. Soul Eve, associate soul, to me beyond compare above all living creatures dear. Well hast thou motioned, well thy thoughts employed, how we might best fulfill the work which here God hath assigned us. Nor of me shall pass unpraised, for nothing lovelier can be found in woman than to study household good, and good works in her husband to promote. Yet not so strict hath our Lord imposed labor as to debar us when we need refreshment, whether food or talk between, food of the mind or of this sweet intercourse of looks and smiles. For smiles from reason flow, to brute denied, and our love the food. Love not the lowest end of human life, for not to irksome toil, but to delight he made us, and delight to reason joined. These paths and bowers doubt not, but our joint hands will keep from wilderness with ease, as wide as we need walk, till younger hands ere long assist us. But if much converse perhaps thee satiate, or to short absence I could yield, for solitude sometimes is best society, and short retirement urges sweet return. But other doubt possesses me, lest harm befall thee severed from me. For thou knowest what hath been warned us, what malicious foe, envying our happiness and of his own despairing, seeks to work us woe and shame by sly assault. And somewhere nigh at hand watches, no doubt, with greedy hope to find his wish and best advantage, us asunder, hopeless to circumvent us joined, where each to other speedy aid might lend at need, whether his first design be to withdraw our fealty from God, or to disturb conjugal love, than which perhaps no bliss enjoined by us excites his envy more, or this, so he might interrupt us in the act of sex, which he envies because he doesn't have this, and this would most upset him, whether it's that or to disrupt. He doesn't know the nature of what this temptation will be. But it will be something, and perhaps it will be that. But if we're together, we will stand with this. And he said, Or this, or worse, leave not the faithful side that gave thee being, which still shades thee and protects. The wife, where danger or dishonor lurks, safeliest and seemliest by her husband stays, who guards her, or with her the worst endures. Now I have to comment here, because in these words, the feminist would immediately recoil. And I don't even think the feminist, everyone who is brought up in a country where the working world, that is the world outside the home, is asserted as the highest form of work, will find these condescending, perhaps pejorative. The idea that studying household good and good works in her husband to promote is the highest good, not many would agree with that. Remember context, first of all. The household and the good of the house is the home, and there is nothing else but the home there. And working within the home is genuine work, and it's not paid work, but it's productive work. And it's work for the family, of which Adam and Eve are the first thing. It's genuinely productive to them, so it's in their own interest. And household good is the good of everyone within the house, including those who are the most dependent, which are the children. And they're not yet there, but he will talk about the good of the household and the freedom that comes from that, and the society that comes from that. And we're used to the working world now, and the great publicity it has attained in recent centuries, as if your whole being were fulfilled by working for a wage. And this speaks rather contrary to it. It's not demeaning, or at least the intent is in no way demeaning for this to be said. He's simply suggesting that there is a good in the household which is a genuine one. It's little said. It probably needs to be repeated for that reason. But he is worried by her suggestion, because her suggestion is precisely the thing that puts them most at a disadvantage. Of course, if he separates the two, it's divide and conquer, right? And they've been warned about that. Having said that, how does Eve respond to this? To whom the virgin majesty of Eve, as one who loves. By the way, virgin here does not mean she's not had sexual relations with Adam. It's already been described earlier in the book, in book 4. Milton's quite clear and intentional in putting that in, because there are, in the church fathers, some of the patristic age was influenced by paganism and thought that sex was the vehicle for the fall, even though it doesn't say that in Scripture. And that's because they were influenced by the pagans who thought that the body was evil, and that the soul, the mind, was good and the body was not. And so the sexual act, because it's a physical thing, was the means by which evil was brought about. No basis in Scripture for it, but Milton wants to ward off the ancient heresy by making it clear that the sexual act had taken place before the fall and not merely after it. Right? It will take place after as well. We'll see at the end of the book 9, but it's also there. So the virgin majesty here simply means that she's innocent still. So her mind is innocent of all harm. There's no harm in her. And the reason that needs to be said is because Milton has to, and here's his challenge. I'll say this because we're not going to get nearly as far through this as I had hoped and intended at first. Milton's challenge here is to describe a human pair that has not fallen, who bears no marks of sin in their thinking or their actions, no signs of selfishness, whose reason is intact, and yet will be able to fall. And will have to fall plausibly. He's going to describe the temptation scene in exhaustive detail. If you look at Genesis 3:1-6, that's the whole temptation scene. He's going to expand it over a whole 1,000 lines in book 9. And he's going to do some things with the text which I think are problematic. So one of them is that he separates the two. If you look at Genesis 3, the temptation scenes with the serpent, the serpent does speak to Eve, there's no doubt about that, but we're told, I believe it's in verse 5, that she eats from the fruit and then she gives some to Adam who is with her. So the question is, if Adam is Eve's head, as Milton asserts and as it also asserts in Scripture, why is he standing around like a signpost while the serpent is speaking to Eve and telling her to do what he's been told they both ought not to do? And why does he allow that to happen? Why doesn't he intervene? Why doesn't he speak? And when she eats of it, why then does he also eat of it? But the problem there is in the Genesis text, and it's not, it doesn't give us answers. It's a problematic, like, who is this, our question, who is this serpent? Why is he there? The prohibition against eating the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that's clear. And here it's about to happen from this mysterious figure called the serpent. Why is Adam not doing anything? Because he is the one who's told not to eat of it. Eve is not yet there. She's a rib at the point at which Adam is told it. Right? So all these things are mysterious in the Genesis text. It's a factual recording of what happens, not even of the narrative per se. It's a very brief account, a little dialogue, which Milton expands upon. Milton tries for, I think, dramatic reasons to separate the two and allow Eve to be subdued to it, and then Adam's going to come along and see her fallen. So he might solve certain problems, but he creates other problems for himself. One is departed from the text. More problematic is that Adam, by that point, it's clear that he knows that Eve has fallen, and he chooses to fall with her. And he's not even being tempted. Well, Eve offers it to him, but it's clear from the text. We'll get to it next time, and we'll move on to conclude our discussion. It's clear that he knows that it's the wrong thing to do, and yet he does it anyway. Moved not by her arguments, but simply because he loves Eve and can't bear to be parted from her, which creates further problems. And the other problem for him, which I've already cited, is to give us a sense of the plausibility of the fall before the fall, but that's to suggest sinful motivations before the fall. So that it's really just like when he's describing heaven, he has his problem. It's easier to describe hell for him, actually. But when he comes to describe heaven, he has a task that he can't surmount. When he's describing an unfallen humanity, how could they come to do this? And I think you'll find that he does rather a good job of it, but still, the problem remains. And separating the two doesn't solve the problem. And it creates other problems, because some suggest that it's because Milton has a low view of women and their capacities and so forth, which I dispute myself. I don't think that is the case. But it has been contended that Milton had a very low of women, et cetera, and that's why he separates the two. So he shows her being duped by the devil and so forth. And I think, well, but actually, it says that in Scripture, that Eve was deceived, not Adam. So it's not that Milton's, just asserting that. He is coming from there. Well, that just pushes it to Peter then, I guess, the problem. But anyway, we'll come to all those things next time. I believe we're done here. But I will finish book 9, and then we'll move on a little bit to 10, and we'll probably then jump over 11 to come to 12. So, and when we come to 12, the line numbers there, we won't do the whole of 12. We will come to, just so you know and don't have to read all of it. So just read the beginning of 10. And then when it comes to book 12, where is it? Line 567, I believe. (552) to the end in book 12. Okay?